Hello and welcome to a new Lupus podcast. We record these podcasts for you every month, so you'll always be able to keep up to date with the latest literature and expert opinions. My name is Eric Morand. I'm a Sir John Monash Distinguished Professor at Monash University and Head of Rheumatology at Monash Health. Today I'm joined by my colleague, Associate Professor Rangi Kandane-Rathnayake, who's the Director of the Asia Pacific Lupus Collaboration and a Senior Researcher in the Lupus team here at Monash University. Hi, Rangi.
Hello, Eric. Nice to do this forum with you.
It's great. Let's do these two papers right away. Let's jump straight in. We've got two papers today covering from the August Lupus Forum, and I'm going to do the first one. So our first paper has a long title of ERA Reconnect Slick SLE Euro Expert Consensus on the Therapeutic Management of Rare Systemic Lupus Erythematosus Manifestations. And this paper was published in the Lancet Rheumatology in July, and the lead author was Laurent Arnaud. Now, this is a busy slide, and it summarizes the whole paper for you. The group that did this work is a collaboration between the European Reference Network on Rare and Complex CTDs, ERA Reconnect, the SLIC group, the Systemic Lupus International Collaborating Clinics, and the SLE Euro Expert Consensus group. And what they identified in a literature search was a large range of manifestations of lupus for which there is little evidence-based guidelines on management. We know we have the EULAR and ACR guidelines for the general management of SLE and also several different guidelines for lupus nephritis. But many other manifestations, especially rare manifestations, lack a clear guidance for clinicians. In expert centres, there may be experience with these manifestations, but in other centres where these events are rare, that experience may be lacking. So the goal of this process was to identify gaps and undertake a systematic approach to addressing them. They used a four-step formal consensus process with 119 participants. There were 658 nominations of rare manifestations to consider making recommendations on. These were refined through deletion of redundancies, etc., down to 45. The consensus process then agreed to make work go forward on 21 of those. The next step in a strategy and a mechanism like this is that strategies are nominated against those 21 indications. 234 strategies were nominated, and in the end, a formal consensus methodology was used to rank those down to the final findings that are summarized on this slide. So the summary that I'm going to present to you is fairly high level. Antimalarials like hydroxychloroquine were recommended as the background and mainstay therapy across all indications for SLE unless contraindicated. Interestingly, intravenous pulse methylprednisolone was included as part of the treatment paradigm for non-severe lupus by 80% of respondents and for severe lupus by 100% of respondents, flagging, as we've seen in recent years, the increasing trend to using IV methylprednisolone pulses to initiate therapy on the belief that this lowers overall exposure to steroid over time. Doses recommended were varied from 125 milligram per dose to 1,000 milligram per dose. In addition, in broad terms, cyclophosphamide was recommended across a number of manifestations, including CNS disease, pancreatitis, myocarditis, and pneumonitis. Plasma exchange was recommended for TMA, and rituximab was recommended for transverse myelitis. As shown on the slide here, and I do direct you to the paper for more detail, there were combinations of treatments recommended for the variety of manifestations, such as, let's just pick one there, for SLE, enteritis, and pancreatitis on the top right. The recommendation was hydroxychloroquine, because that's everywhere, glucocorticoids, including pulse steroids, and combine that with cyclophosphamide or mycophenolate. At the bottom right, for rare skin manifestations, the preferred strategy was a combination of antimalarials, steroids, and anifrolumab, or MMF. And I'm sure that's guided by the emerging evidence of the role of type 1 interferon in cutaneous manifestations of lupus. So this expert-based consensus provides a valuable framework for guiding therapeutic decisions in areas where there is no trial evidence but groups of very experienced experts can reach consensus on recommendations that may guide our colleagues who lack that expertise or exposure to those manifestations. So I won't go into all the detail of the paper because it was very detailed and thorough, but that's the summary, and I thoroughly recommend it to you. What did you think, Rangi?
Look, I think it's very comprehensively done, representing a lot of group, a lot of expert investigators involved, 119, representing across many regions. So I think it's very well done. It's interesting to see that although the kind of narrowed down to, was it 45 manifestations, they started from a really big list. But just looking at the recommendations, it's interesting to see. So that's like hydroxychloroquine seem to be universally recommended. Do you think that's kind of now almost accepted as background therapy, even if it is a rare manifestation?
Well, I think we know that hydroxychloroquine has a number of benefits for lupus patients, including reduced rates of flare and relapse, probably reduced cardiovascular events. Even in lupus nephritis, a protective effect is seen. So, although we don't have evidence in these rare manifestations, it stands to reason that it would still benefit patients with these manifestations. Because in many cases, patients with these rare manifestations also have, more frequent, more common manifestations at the same time.
And I also noticed the lack of recommendations for biologics except for efficacy.
Mhm.
And for the skin manifestations, I guess it could be due to the lack of evidence. But what do you think about the use of biologics in these manifestations?
Yes, well, unfortunately, what I think is sort of not the point, although I appreciate the question. The whole idea of this study was to move away from what one person thinks and try to get a
Mm.
groupthink approach to these issues. And I think one could always challenge or have a different view to these consensus-driven expert opinions. Um, but I think these consensus-driven expert opinions allow a clinician to see what other people think when they see a manifestation like this. They might think, oh, I think I'd like to use belimumab. What did that expert group say? They'll have a
Mm.
look. They can still make their own decision, and there may be reasons to prefer one agent over another based on access, for one thing, cost, availability, tolerance, and so on. So I think these are not instructions for
Mm.
doctors on what they must do. It's a representation of expert opinion that people can refer to when they're looking for guidance. I think serves a really valuable purpose.
Well put. Thank you.
Let's move on to the next paper. Over to you, Rangi.
Thank you, Eric. So I'm going to discuss with you the paper that was also published in this year, led by Nan Shen and colleagues. And the title of the paper is Efficacy, Pharmacokinetics, and Safety of Iscalimab in Patients with Proliferative Lupus Nephritis. Now, this was a randomized, double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 2 study where they tested this new drug called iscalimab, which is a novel anti-CD40 humanized monoclonal antibody. So as the title says, the study was to evaluate the pharmacokinetics and the safety of this novel drug. So to conduct this, they recruited or they enrolled 57 patients. They randomized them to 2-to-1 ratio. So 38, was it 38? 39 received the iscalimab and then 18 received the placebo. You can see the details on the methods, but essentially they gave the drug and then followed the patients up to 24 weeks, assessing the UPCR, which is the primary endpoint, the relative reduction in UPCR, and then further 24 weeks to assess the adverse outcomes. As I said, the primary endpoint was the reduction in UPCR. And in this, we can see in the results, they showed the primary result, which is actually recorded in estimated geometric mean UPCR because they have log transformed the results. Essentially, you can see that the UPCR reduced over time, and it was statistically significant in patients who received iscalimab by 24 weeks. Those are the patients received indicated in orange compared to the placebo patients who received placebo. So I must mention that I've got then they gave this therapy iscalimab as an add-on therapy. So the patients were proliferative lupus nephritis patients, and they were allowed to receive glucocorticoids or plus up to one immunosuppressants as their standard of care therapy. So this is just to assess the benefits of add-on therapy. And they were careful just to make that that a standard of care just to limit to the one immunosuppression. I believe that is to manage the risk of infections and all the other adverse outcomes. So overall, the key finding of this paper is that they did find the primary endpoint, which was the reduction in UPCR, to be statistically significant by week 24. However, when they assessed the adverse events, they did observe pretty much similar proportions of patients in both arms experiencing adverse events. And I think there were 2 deaths reported in the iscalimab arm. One was reported to be unrelated, but the second one, they couldn't really rule out that it's totally not part of because of this pathway.
Yeah.
So overall it's very well done. Although it's a relatively small number of patients, it's still significant result, and this is a proof of concept.
Yeah. Rangi, let me ask you about that because the audience may not know that Rangi is an expert statistician. Talk to me about the p-value of 0.07, the use of a one-sided test. Is that a concern or is that acceptable here?
No, I mean, that's a great point. If you just see it as 0.07, then you might think, oh, is that really statistically significant? But in this case, it is. Because this is when they estimated this is one-sided, what you call the one-sided test, because the authors only wanted to see the relative reduction. So no harm was estimated. So the alpha level, they set it up at 10%. So yes, so according to their study, and they did calculate this, estimate the sample size and all, so that the number I think they wanted only about 60 patients to see. So I think they did all that, and then according to these results, this can be considered as statistically significant.
Yeah.
But it is interesting because I think although they achieved this, their primary endpoint was statistically significant, but the sponsor and the authors, I believe, decided not to pursue this as a further study.
Yeah.
Overall,
I think it's important that authors and sponsors do publish trials like this, even if the further development is not planned, because we know there's a CD40 ligand antibody, daprilizumab, that's had a successful phase 3 trial in non-renal lupus. This finding with the CD40 monoclonal suggests that reduction in proteinuria can be seen with this biology in patients with lupus nephritis. And so it still helps us understand the evidence base and the biology when we see a targeted therapy in a specific endpoint like proteinuria. So it's still helpful. Okay, I think we better wrap up in the interest of time. So Rangi, thank you so much for taking part in today's podcast.
And thank you, Eric. And it's been a great pleasure to be part of this Lupus Forum. Thank you.